Welcome everyone to the EU Open Source Policy Summit 2022. Thank you for being with us today. We are very happy to see so many of you here. My name is Paula Grzegorzewska and I am OFE's Strategic Partnerships Director. I will be the master of ceremonies throughout the day and perhaps more importantly, a strict time enforcer. At this event, a few years back, when it was a much smaller face-to-face meeting in Brussels, Piers O'Donoghue of the European Commission gave a speech that we often come back to at OFE. He asked the open source stakeholders in the room to step up, to become strategic partners of governments when tackling the grand challenges these governments are faced with. The EU Open Source Policy Summit is our attempt to create a forum for just that, discussing open source and the grand challenges of our times. So, what do we mean by the grand challenges? We mean challenges that cannot be tackled by an individual, country, or business alone. We mean those challenges that require a coordinated and collective effort. So, as you can tell, we set the bar quite high for our speakers at the summit. Thank you to all the speakers for joining. And of course, a special thank you to our gold sponsors, the Eclipse Foundation, Red Hat, and SUSE, and to our silver sponsors, GitHub, IBM, Nextcloud, PwC, Strategy and Univention for supporting this event. Finally, thank you to all of you who make up this vibrant open source community. But before we get into the different challenges that we have shaped our sessions around, I would like to invite on stage OFE's Executive Director, Astor Numelin-Karlberg, Emeritus Chairman of OFE, Graham Taylor, and our new Chairman, Sachiko Muto.
Thank you, Paula. Hello, Sachiko. Hello, Graham. And hello, everyone in the audience. Well, so we're not an organization that often looks back into our history, but OFE is turning 20 this year. So I hope you'll allow us to indulge briefly. Graham, I'm thinking, looking back, why did you, Bob, and Basil start OFE 20 years ago?
Yeah, it really is amazing that it is 20 years. You can see from the grey hairs what's happened in that time. When we started, we had our first challenges, I think, in recognizing that it was so unknown and that there were very few people who could really discuss it. But what we saw as the opportunity, the business opportunity from open source was very much something that crossed both the commercial and the public sector. So the first challenge that we had really was this issue about that business knowledge was minimal. So we literally spent all our time explaining and educating. So we had all the classics being thrown at us: free versus open, security. And interestingly, one of the toughest was why the investment community should be interested if they didn't own the code. So we very quickly, though, found that there were some very high blockers to implementation of open source in the business community. And as an example, we did a little survey here in the UK that something like 90% of the UK local government sector had lost that ability to easily implement new systems. And that was because they were dependent on single proprietary solutions. So that's when the term competitive lock-in was invented. And again, another little bit of anecdote is that same time, we obviously speaking to all of the major multinationals, and there was one large technology multinational, very well known, and there was precisely one person in the whole of Europe that had any knowledge of open source at that stage. So, there were challenges, and the second challenge, as I think everybody realized clearly, was a blocker was the one of open standards, the limitation and how you overcome this competitive advantage. So that became a core issue for OFE and really has remained one of those core issues throughout all our years in this area. I think open source and open standards now, though, are pretty well understood and obviously pretty ubiquitous in many ways, although there's still the dangers of misunderstanding them, probably deliberately in many cases. But we realized that we really needed to try to understand at least what this issue of openness was about. openness, open technologies, whatever you want, and try to understand the cultures, the collegiate behavior, the community working, etc. And we realized that the key thing was that it wasn't a science, and we needed to bring in some new thinking. So that's when we introduced the Open Forum Academy. And that group has been incredibly helpful in setting up and really get the thinking for something like the open principles, the OFE open principles, which I know you want to touch on later. So challenges all the way through, they've been varying, and I'm sure they're going to continue. So best of luck, guys.
And Sachiko, I'm thinking, Paula mentioned the speech by Mr. O'Donoghue when he challenged the open source community to step up. You were there, so I'm thinking now, a few years later, is this happening? If so, how?
I was there. You were there too, Astor, and I think clearly it had a big impact on us. And I think it is happening, and I think in terms of how this how we have worked over the last few years and how this summit has developed, it had a great impact, and we will see some great examples, I think, today of how the open source community is stepping up on those issues of strategic importance to governments. If I have time to mention a few, we'll talk about those later, obviously, but I don't have to go further than to talk about the response to the COVID pandemic, which I think brought maybe to the larger audience really the benefits of sharing, collaborating, and just being able to innovate on top of existing solutions. Just the benefits of that, I think, became really evident, and I'm looking forward to that panel. Another example is, I think, in the area of energy and green transitions. We'll have a great panel on that as well. And I think that's also where the community is bringing forward evidence and explaining just how sort of open collaboration can help with some of the biggest challenges that we're facing today. Just finally, also the big issue of digital sovereignty. I think there's been a lot of effort just by us and by others in the community, just to show how open source can play a role in enabling European countries to have a greater control, and while at the same time continue to benefit from international collaboration. So I think those are some examples of how open source and the communities in open source are really sort of stepping up to this challenge. Yeah.
And I thought, Graham, you mentioned before briefly the openness principles of OFE, and I think this is an interesting point of continuity now when we're talking about 20 years of OFE and the three of us on stage. Both of you, Sachiko and Graham, this was before my time. This is something I've inherited, and it's the OFE's openness principles, and they are perhaps not so widely discussed by us publicly, but I can tell you they really drive and inspire our day-to-day work. They're right there and kind of guide us through everything, every new challenge as they have in the past. I thought, could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about them? Because I think we're going to put them a bit further in our communications going forward.
Yeah, that'd be good, Astor. Thanks. I think the first thing to say is I hinted at really is one of the things that we recognize is that openness is a phrase. It's so easy just to add to a name of a product or even an organization, dare I admit. And it doesn't say a lot. Unless you try to at least explain what you mean by it. And we started on the trail of saying, how do you define open? And very quickly found that it isn't something you can easily define, probably don't want to. And that's how we ended up with coming up with these 5 principles. And they very much are really trying to describe a culture rather than anything specific. So, the principles, I'm not sure if we've got them up on the screen anywhere, but is user centricity, which is all about saying, we'll start with what the user thinks about it, about competition, maintaining and growing competition, allowing competition, flexibility, which is all about the ability to mix and match and to bring in other substitute products and grow and develop the infrastructure, sustainability, pretty obvious. And the final one is community. And I think that all of that was just trying to capture what we mean by it without trying to form it into a definition. So I'm not surprised that you don't see it every day in OFE literatures or publications, because it's not something there, but it needs to be behind everything that we're thinking about, and hopefully that's something that we can help on the education side. Sachiko, I don't know if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, just to say, I do think those principles are still valid, but the challenge is, of course, to keep translating them into what brings value in the current context. And that's something certainly that I try to do throughout my time at OFE, is just remind myself that, what we are promoting is not open source as an end in itself, but really, it's about furthering these principles. And I think, user centricity is a really important one, especially for the public sector. 10 years ago, I think open source was still a lot about cost saving, but I think some of those aspects now are becoming, quite recognized now. Just how you will be able to have better tailored solutions and the flexibility that comes with that. And just final words, that I think community is also one that I see a lot of focus on now. And I think that just how we ensure the sustainabilities of communities, which is really what delivers the value of open source. I think to solve that challenge, as open source is becoming more ubiquitous, as Graham said, is just crucial. And I think it would be naive to think that this happens automatically. So some more process and thinking around that, I think, is something we're going to have to look, sort of focus on moving forward. So.
Yeah, thank you. And then, this continuity and inheriting these principles is of course very helpful for our team now, as we're moving on, trying to place OFE in these discussions around the grand challenges and the big strategic considerations. We'll touch on this throughout the day, of course, but just as OFE, we're an organization, a little part of this big community that is open source, and we're trying to do our part. And the principles, I think, help people that see us from the outside or within these communities to see kind of what we add. And I think this goes for what has maintained us for 20 years. It's a lot of organizations that kind of come and go in Brussels, but it definitely says something to you guys that OFE has been around for 20 years and has this history to draw from when it comes to looking to the grand challenges in the future. Well, thank you very much, Graham and Sachiko. I will take the opportunity to address the audience briefly as well. But looking forward to, of course, both Sachiko and Graham are still part of the OFE family. So, which is, of course, with me now taking the role as executive director, it's very helpful. But before I hand it back to Paula, let me say a few words as well, just to from my point of view, put this summit into context. Today, open source is huge. It is ubiquitous and it's economically important. And in fact, open source is unavoidable since it's present in almost every single digital device, every software package. I really think one can say that it is software today, and which we'll also talk about, increasingly hardware. This is a point that I think is very important to underscore for anyone who's relatively new to open source. Just the mere scale of the global community. And I think policymakers need to look at these immense innovation streams as an important resource when addressing our greatest challenges, be them sustainability, our current, but also future pandemics, dependencies in the semiconductor space, and digital sovereignty more generally. Open source stakeholders are, however, stepping up to the challenge. Last year, 8 of Europe's open source business associations came together to form APPEL, the European Open Source Business Association. Their aim is, on the one hand, to advocate for their policy objectives, but on the other, they're looking to increase the coordination and capacity of the industry as a whole. I think, in my view, this is exactly the kind of maturing and institutionalization that the open source ecosystem needs when engaging in the policy space. This is really stepping up. I mean, open source is big now. And with this bigness comes increased responsibility. And with this bigness, it means that open source stakeholders should think bigger. Our economic impact study that I hope that you've all seen, we've tried to communicate it far and wide. But this study shows that there is a lot of economic value in open source. But that is far from the full story. I think society can learn a lot about strategic, pre-competitive collaboration, innovation, and value creation from open source. So for us at OFE, this summit, but perhaps more importantly, our day-to-day work, is meant to build bridges between policymakers and open source stakeholders. I believe that we've been quite successful in doing this over the past 20 years. And we're, of course, very grateful to all our supporters over the years who have helped make this possible. But the reality is that there's still a big discrepancy between where open source is in the market and where it is in the policy discussions. There are many ways to support the efforts of closing this gap. And one way is, of course, to work with us. Last week, we announced that Nextcloud is joining OFE as a supporter, which we're very excited about. And feel free to reach out to us at OFE if you'd like to discuss how we can work together. But back to policy a little bit. To policymakers' credit, they have not been idle. Just look at the past few months. France's government is building a national open source program office, as is the European Commission. Germany has very ambitious plans. Looking outside of Europe, however, the approach to open source policy is looking more to the geopolitical and strategic. Last month, there was an open source security summit convened by the White House. In China, there is ample mention of open source as part of geopolitical strategy in their latest 5-year plan. And I believe that in the coming years, open source hold great potential for Europe to lead in the next and future waves of digitization. And here, I think it's also, however, important to mention that Europe is already a leader in open source. And I don't think that's a surprise. In many ways, there is something inherently European about open source. Collaboration crosses borders, a diverse multitude working together and innovating together. And that is what the speakers of today's summit have come together to talk about. And where, as Paula said, it's all about these challenges that are greater than any organization, company, or country. I mean, think of the EU as a collaboration to achieve harmonization and lower barriers to create something bigger together. It does so through norms and rules, such as its freedom of movement. Open source does this through its 4 freedoms. There is something spiritually linked here. But with this, I believe I've already spoken too long. So let me therefore hand it back to Paula to get this summit going. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to hearing all the speakers and panelists.